Okay, hello everybody. With my new camera, my new computer, I'm quite front and center here on the video, but we won't have me on here for too long. Welcome to the lecture designed to replace the lesson for Monday, April 20th. In addition to this lecture, I plan on going back, possibly during class Monday, and going through a handout that will work through the Keynesian spending multiplier step by step, and another worksheet on the office, which is online, but it'll make a lot more sense when we go through it live. So there'll be another piece to this. I'll have to decide when I can record it. I'm hoping that my document camera arrives so I can do that. So we're going to get started where we left off today. I want to make sure that everybody watches the video all the way through today because I got some excellent questions after class, and we provided some information about the tax multiplier, as well as some information about kind of the nuts and bolts of how to solve for equilibrium in the Keynesian example. So if you're having any trouble really with any of the concepts that we talked about today being Wednesday the 15th, be sure to watch that video because I think there's some really great information in there even after the class time itself ended. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I wanted to share my screen with some stuff from Chrome here first. First, I thought this was kind of interesting. You know, obviously, most of us, I know not all of us, were pretty overjoyed that the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. And the way the virus spread, starting in California well before it got to Missouri and Kansas, there could have been a lot of people infected at this party for the 49ers had that occurred. So it kind of indirectly saved lives. So I thought that was interesting. Another thing I want to make sure we pointed out to everybody is the boom and bust video, Fear the Boom and Bust. You can find that on YouTube with versus Hayek. If that helps you to remember that Keynes is an interventionist, that his would be to try to take action to the economy moving in a direction that we may want it to. I think that that's something that you would want to take a look at. This video, it's kind of funny, and it also brings Keynes's views into light. Another video I came up with, and I thought about showing it in class, is this Keynesian multiplier and pay it forward. If you've never seen this movie, again, you could search for it on criticalcommons.org, but it's most of you are familiar with this concept. Obviously, today, where we're hoping folks are looking out for one another and helping, it's especially poignant. But the young man really helps 3 other people, and if they each help 3 people, that multiplier effect explodes exponentially, and you get a lot of people that get helped. That's the way the Keynesian spending multiplier is designed to operate. The margin propensity to consume is going to be very important, and the higher the margin propensity to consume, the bigger that multiplier effect. So we're going to pick up in our notes where we left off. Here in our chapter 20 notes as we share those. And we left off today with solving for the spending multipliers. The spending multiplier is simply 1 over the margin propensity to consume. And if we I got a little distracted there. I used my email, so that wouldn't happen again. If we take a margin propensity to consume here of 0.9, that gives us a margin propensity to save of 0.1. So let's just, to make sure we're clear about the relationship between the margin propensity to save and the margin propensity to consume, let's include propensity to save here for each example. Now, why is the margin propensity to save equal to 0.1? Again, this is a question we answered at the end of the class today. If you go back and look at that video, every dollar that we pay, we can either spend it, save it, or have it taxed. And for the most part, we're assuming that taxes are not existing at the margin. Therefore, there is a formula that tells us that the margin propensity to consume, the percentage of that income I earn that I spend, plus the marginal propensity to save, the percentage of that income that I earn that I save, is going to be equal to 1. So in this case, the marginal propensity to save is 0.1, 0.2, and a 0.5 respectively. The greater, if you think about the Keynesian multiplier, showed that pay it forward. Another example I like to talk about is if you throw a rock into a creek or something, or into the river or whatever, or a pond, you're going to see those ripple effects, right? When the rock hits the water, those ripples get smaller and smaller as they continue to extend out from our original splash. Those ripples can be the types of spending that occur with the multiplier effect. So if I'm $100, my marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, and I'm the government, the person that receives that $100, 90% of 100. The next person spends $81. The next person spends 90% of $81 or $72.90, so on and so on and so forth. If you work through the iterations, eventually you get this spending multiplier of 10. For a multiplier, marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, you get a spending multiplier of 5, and a marginal propensity to consume of 0.5, you get a spending multiplier of 2. The tax multiplier is going to be negative. Why? Because if your income goes up, you spend more. But if your taxes go up, you have less take-home income and you spend less. And again, the math behind this, I explained this at the end of the class Wednesday, so I'm going to encourage you to go look at that to get this detail. What you really need to know for the exam is that the multiplier is indeed negative. I said spending. The tax multiplier is negative. More taxes equal less GDP in terms of this Keynesian equilibrium. And the multiplier is smaller than the Keynesian spending multiplier. And the reason for that is taxes do not directly influence spending, whereas government spending does directly influence spending. This is the example I plan to work through on Monday, where I show these ripple effects getting canceled out if you have equal increase in spending and equal higher taxes. Okay, so what we want to do is solve for this equilibrium. And as we solve for another equilibrium, we give an example here where you take consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending in this case. What do we do to solve for this equilibrium? Hopefully we remember this from our earlier discussion. I'm going to give you a minute to think about that, but you have to remember the Keynesian equilibrium, which is total spending, C plus I plus G, and if we wanted to, we can add net exports here. I probably should, but we have no net exports in this case, so we'll just include that just to be on the safe side. Net exports equals 0. I could have stated that, but I did. We'll show why there's one unique equilibrium in this case. Well, the equilibrium comes from this equilibrium condition. Now, my question to you is solve this yourself. Try to pause the video and see if you can solve this yourself, because these are kind of problems that we're going to ask you to solve. Please pause the video, make an effort. I'm just going to show you the steps that we're going to get to this equilibrium here. And it looks like I may have to adjust this a little bit. Okay, so as we solve for equilibrium, 200 plus 100 plus 100 equals 400. And then obviously this 0.9, once again, as we mentioned before, the consumption function is always going to give us this marginal propensity to consume here. Okay, marginal propensity to consume here is going to be equal to 0.9. And so we have a marginal propensity to consume. I don't know what just happened there. Marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.9. That's going to give us a multiplier effect, certainly, if we decide to work for that. And we're going to see that 400 plus 0.9y equals y. We subtract off the 0.9y from both sides. Of course, this y is the same. We could put a 1 in front of it. That's the same as 1y. So 1 minus 0.9 is 0.1. That gives us 400 equals 0.1y. We divide both sides by 0.1 or multiply by 10. If that helps us, we have to remember 400 divided by 0.1. is going to be equal to 4,000. And that's where that answer comes from. 4,000 is your equilibrium level of income. Like this on your homework. You will certainly have questions like this on your exam. Okay. We scroll down. What happens to the equilibrium level of output if investment spending increased or government spending or net exports increased by $100? Again, marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. 1 over 0.1, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume is 10. That's going to give us a multiplier of 10. So for every $1 of spending that goes up in this unique equilibrium, that's going to tell us that the multiplier is equal to 10. And we can take a $1 change in spending to get the $10 ultimate change in spending, or $100 change in spending would increase GDP by $1,000. Now, you want to check yourself, go back and plug in up here for investment equals 200. And if you go back through this equation and solve it, y equals 5,000. Either way, whether you apply the Keynesian spending multiplier or if you apply the equilibrium condition, C plus I plus G plus NX Y, you should get $5,000 as your equilibrium level of income, right? Okay, now where we also finished up real quickly today was comparing and contrasting the classical and the Keynesian case. The classical economists are going to be known as non-interventionists. The Keynesian economists will typically be interventionists. They're going to say that aggregate demand may fall short and we need to step in to fix the problem by typically increasing government spending to increase output. Classical economic model, only land, labor, capital, and technology will affect output. This implies that the aggregate supply curve is vertical, as we demonstrated earlier. Keynesian model says these things matter, but so do spending. So do components of aggregate demand. Those things, when they increase spending, that can increase output. Why? Because Keynes is discussing the economy during a time of not enough aggregate demand. He's assuming here that we have a lot of involuntary unemployment, a lot of, if the economy is fully functioning, you can't push on a string. You can't continue to push forward even when the economy is at full employment. So if the economy is at full employment, Keynes is not going to recommend these policies. But when there's a lack of spending, high unemployment, Keynes felt that government spending could come in and help create a situation where the economy starts to move forward. If government spending goes up, we only see an increase in the price level, not an increase in the level of output. I look back, I found this morning. Remember, the classical economic model, if you can see this here in the corner, has this vertical aggregate supply curve. So if aggregate demand goes up because of increase in investment, what happens? We don't see an increase in output because output is fixed at this point where we're at full output. In other words, in the classical model, this is going to be hard to see, but we're going to look at this and say, you know what, y star is equal to y. What is y star? Let's move back so we can see this here. Y star is complete full output and full employment. The classical model assumes that we're always at full employment. So this increase in aggregate demand doesn't change y, it all changes p. And then obviously, if we did this, we would go from P1 to P2. So we could see that this would be inflationary in the classical model with an increase in aggregate demand, but it would not be changing output because this output is determined completely by the location of the aggregate supply curve. It's determined completely by land, labor, capital, technology. You may think it's silly, but I would like you to say that with me, that your friends in class are doing the same. What are those four things that can affect output in the classical model? land, labor, capital, technology. Land, labor, capital, technology. Those are the four things that can increase output, because those are the things that increase supply, and those are the things that matter in the classical model. As we're talking about, Keynesian model is obviously quite different. So we'll go back to ours here. Wages and prices are perfectly flexible in the classical model. In the Keynesian model, that's one of the reasons that in the short run, and that marginal revolution video we asked you to watch for Friday does a really nice job of explaining this. Firms in the short run are going to experience higher profit margins and higher prices before their costs catch. And that's that aggregate supply curve in the short run is upward sloping and not vertical. Money illusion, this idea that when I get a raise, I may spend a lot of money because I think I have more money, but I've only gotten a nominal raise, not a real raise. If your wage goes up 5% and inflation goes up 5%, you're really no buff. You should not change your behavior. Classical economists assume that people are aware of this, and therefore spending will remain the same. In the Keynesian model, money illusion can be a big difference. People may not completely grasp the idea that they really don't have a higher real wage if their nominal wage goes up. Spending multiple zero in the classical model. Why? Because only some factors determine output in the classical model. In the Keynesian model, this multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save, or 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. We know that's overstating reality. We know that in the real world, spending will not increase output that much, but this is at least the potential increase in output. Okay. Hopefully we're all good with that. Let's look at some other issues about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. All right, as I've said, we taught you the we taught you the Keynesian spending multiplier to show what could happen in the economy. We know that's an overstatement of reality. Let's look at a short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. In this case, we're showing that there's going to be a trade-off between higher prices and more output, but it's not going to be completely unaffected by the price level. Firms will be willing and able to produce more output in the short run with higher prices than they were before. Again, I'm encouraging you to watch the Marginal Revolution video. That explains it very nicely and concisely. And certainly you can ask me questions about this on the discussion board or at any of the reviews we're giving, whether it be tonight, the 15th, the 20th, or the 21st. Okay, so this demonstrates when aggregate demand changes, there's probably going to be a trade-off between output and prices. Because we want higher output. We really don't want higher prices, other things held equal. First thing we need to look at is this aggregate demand curve being downward sloping. Aggregate demand consists of total spending at different points in the economy, okay? So if we look at this aggregate demand curve, why is it downward sloping? We're going to explain that, but aggregate demand itself is made up of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Most of those types of spending will tend to increase when the price level falls. This explains this. What makes up aggregate demand? So if it helps, I would like everybody to take this C plus I plus G plus NX and write it on your graph right here next to aggregate demand. So when we draw the aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve, we're understanding that this is what determines the aggregate demand curve. Once again, let me just try to do this. I won't even show it completely. If I draw this here on the side, just to show you exactly what I want you to do. We have aggregate PL for price level. I'm going to abbreviate here a little bit. Y equals real GDP. And here is the aggregate demand curve, right? It's downward sloping as we've shown. right next to that, write out that this aggregate demand is going to be consisting of consumption, investment, government, and net exports. It's probably very difficult to read that. I need a thinner Sharpie, but the components of spending are what make up aggregate demand: consumption, investment, government spending, and indeed net exports. All right. So why is the aggregate demand curve downward sloping? Because all of these types of spending are influenced by the price level except for government spending. The consumption spending tends to increase when we have lower price levels because inherited wealth that people might have becomes more valuable. When we have lower prices, the money that we have is going to be able to buy more goods and services. People might be inclined to buy more goods and services in that case. The interest rate effect states that in a real sense, when the price level falls, the money supply in a real sense has increased, okay? And once that money supply has increased, that drives down the interest rate, as we showed with expansionary monetary policy last week. Lower interest rates are going to stimulate investment spending. So other things equal, lower price levels lead to higher investment spending because we expect to see also lower interest rates, ceteris paribus. Finally, we're going to sell more exports to other countries if we as the US have lower prices. So consumption, investment, and government spending all tend to increase when the price level decreases, which is why this aggregate demand curve is sloping. Now, the question we want to ask ourselves is, we know that these are not shifts in aggregate demand. What is it that shifts aggregate demand? Anything that is independent or what we might call autonomous, that is an increase in consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, or net exports. That's what we're talking about here. So in other words, our economy right now is in a concerning period. It makes it worse that Japan, China, Italy, other countries are also in a slowdown. That means other things equal, there are fewer consumers for our products, and by that itself, the fact that other countries are struggling is going to decrease our net exports. So we'd rather have our trading partners do well, buying a lot of American goods, keeping our economy moving forward. Taxes or tariffs are generally a negative in terms of overall economic growth for a country. Okay. There are two types of policies out there that can increase aggregate demand. Those are fiscal or monetary policies. We've talked a lot about monetary policies coming from the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve wants to increase spending, what can they do, or at least what could they do up until a few weeks ago? You might ask yourself this. They can, some of you are right, I hope, they can lower interest rates. That's an expansionary monetary policy, and we'll continue to talk through the tools that they have at their disposal to lower interest rates. If the federal government, the president and the Congress, want to increase spending, they control government spending. That's C plus I plus G. That's one of the components. So they can increase government spending, which will directly increase aggregate demand, or they can lower taxes, because obviously if people are paying lower taxes, typically they're going to have more consumption spending or more investment spending as a response to having more take-home income. All right. Obviously, both of these policies tend to be bad for the federal debt, and that's something that is a concern for our economy. I think right now we have to focus on the short term and not the long run, but this is something to keep an eye on, the amount of debt that we're taking on with some of these stimulus plans. So what are fiscal policies? They come from the president of the Congress. They deal with government spending and taxes, and they usually have the biggest impact on consumption spending, although certainly targeted policies in this regard can also affect investment spending. If we have a contractionary fiscal policy, Those are higher taxes and lower government spending. Expansionary fiscal policies are going to be lower taxes and higher government spending. So if we just add to this, just to be clear, our expansionary policies are lower taxes and more government spending. Other things equal, these will typically increase our national debt. Not the best thing, right? Contractionary fiscal policies are going to be, try to find the color here that I can match. Contractionary fiscal policies are going to be the opposite. They're going to be higher taxes, lower government spending, which do tend to, other things equal, reduce the debt and the deficit for that matter. But the implementation of these policies will make the debt less of a concern than it would have been otherwise. Looks back, there's our color. Again, expansionary policies are those that are designed to increase increase aggregate demand. Contractionary policies designed to decrease aggregate demand. Okay, so that's just some clarification there. Again, expansionary monetary policies would be lower interest rates. Contractionary monetary policies would be higher interest rates. Okay. So let's now look at, oh, here's our question. Would the $2.2 trillion stimulus plan be considered a expansionary or contractionary policy? Is it a fiscal or a monetary policy? Again, try to answer that on your own. I'll take a sip of my Hy-Vee flavored water. I don't get paid for that sponsorship, but I like it, and you can hopefully answer that question. The stimulus would obviously be expansionary. It's designed to increase aggregate demand. Why are we doing that? Right now, there's not a lot of spending going on. You could argue there's a decrease in aggregate supply as well, because at least in the short run, long run aggregate supply is based on potential. But right now, we're having a massive decrease in our productive capacity, the economy in the short run. We also have a massive aggregate demand. People are either concerned to spend or they aren't bringing in the income that they would like to have to spend what they want to spend. So the stimulus is an expansionary fiscal policy. I would argue it was necessary, certainly, and I think there may be more necessary policies coming down the road, and those are designed to increase aggregate demand. We talked about this. Monetary policies that are expansionary would be lowering interest rates. So expansionary monetary policies, just again to be clear here, let's come up with a new color. Doesn't matter what it is. But expansionary monetary policy in a nutshell is going to be lowering the interest rate. Okay. All right. Now, it's not just policies that can influence aggregate demand. Other things can affect aggregate demand as well. I mentioned if other countries become better off, we have higher levels of net exports, other things equal. More consumer confidence, we have higher consumption spending. Again, unfortunately, right now we have less consumer confidence and less consumption spending, and we also have less investor confidence and therefore less investment spending. People start to spend less when they're concerned about the future, which makes an expansionary fiscal policy more appropriate. Okay. All right, and then finally, we're going to look at what shifts in aggregate demand due to the economy. This is probably making you a little dizzy here, but what happens in the short run when aggregate demand increases? Well, again, hopefully you're all comfortable with drawing this on your graph, but here is the question itself. What happens in the short run when aggregate demand increases? we want to be able to draw this on our graph. Hopefully we can do that effectively. Remember, what does this aggregate demand consist of? Consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Now, we're not telling you what component of aggregate demand increases here, simply that it has increased. So this is not the same as a change in demand, but the graph itself works. Notice that you have a higher level of aggregate demand, and you're going to expect to see a higher price level, and you're going to expect to see a higher level of output. Now, we may ask this question one of two ways. We may ask, well, what happens to output or what happens to unemployment if we have more output? And we clearly will here. We just show it as best we can. P2 is higher than P1, Y2 is higher than output. Higher levels of output mean we have less unemployment, right? Because if we are hiring more, we're producing more output, we're going to hire more workers. So this little distracting thing, let's make it where it's a little bit more legible. I just wanted to make sure I didn't forget to share it with you. We expect higher price levels and higher output levels. But when we have higher output levels, we're going to have lower unemployment, ceteris paribus, other things equal, right? Now, does this mean, well, let me do the opposite and we'll talk about this. This can be misleading what we're talking about inflation. This does mean that prices will be higher, expect them to be otherwise, okay? Let's go to the other example. Less aggregate demand, some sort of contraction in the economy, which certainly at the minimum, we're seeing a contraction in aggregate demand right now. We expect to see lower output levels. I don't know, we're going to fix some of these things. Lower output levels and higher unemployment. Remember, when we're producing less output, we expect there to be more people that are looking for work, that are unemployed. Now, this implies that we're going to shift this thing to the left. This price level is going to be lower. This is kind of a little bit misleading because it doesn't mean there's going to be deflation. It does mean there's going to be less inflation than we would have had in the absence of this particular change. So for this example, let me get my brown pen out. Hopefully we can understand this. Once again, aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. So if you look at this carefully, you have less output in your economy and lower prices in your economy. Prices are going to fall. Output Y is also going to fall when we have a decrease in aggregate demand. Again, that's certainly something we've been experiencing. So we expect there to be this type of an expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy, for that matter, is trying to offset this recent decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, why is the aggregate supply curve upward sloping? This is explained also in your video pretty well. But again, we mentioned this before. When prices go up, wages are sticky. So prices increase more rapidly than costs. Therefore, firms can profitably sell more output. What shifts the aggregate supply curve? Four things: land, labor, capital, technology. Now, we can also see things like overregulation. If it becomes difficult for a business to operate or to start their business, then that's going to make it more difficult, at least in the short run, for firms to operate and reduce potential output in the economy. So government makes it too difficult for a firm to start. If you remove overregulation, you can see an increase in aggregate supply. On the other hand, Oil prices. One of the things, as bad as the economy has been, and certainly certain aspects of the economy have been hit hard that are in oil producing states, less expensive oil makes it easier to ship goods and services, produce goods and services. That is like a positive supply shock. And certainly oil is less than $20 a barrel today. So we have seen that. It's kind of counterbalanced some of the effects of this harmful economy. A lot of you use that in your ECON selfies, by the way. Note that a shift in the aggregate supply curve is either very harmful or very helpful to our economy, much more so than a change in aggregate demand. The best thing that can happen to your economy is an increase in aggregate supply. The worst thing that can happen to your economy is a decrease in aggregate supply, okay? That's something certainly to keep in mind. If you look at the growth in the economy that's occurred, the best period of growth was during the 90s. Why did that growth occur? Because we had an increase in aggregate supply, okay? We had an increase in aggregate supply in the 90s. You might notice, if you haven't, at the very end of our notes here, I skipped ahead and I put in another little sheet. And I was saying, what happens if we have a decrease in aggregate supply or an increase in aggregate supply for that matter? I'm going to change this question and I'll fix it before I post this. Let's look at the effect of an increase in aggregate supply. I like to do that better, and how that's going to affect the economy. Now, in the 1990s, we had an increase in aggregate supply. Can anybody think about what that was? Hopefully, it's great if you watch this video with someone else and go back and forth and try to answer these questions. I'm going to change decrease to increase. Let's suppose we had an increase in aggregate supply. Maybe, hopefully, you thought of this as the creation of the internet. That was a big deal in terms of a real increase in technological capacity, big technology increase, and an increase in aggregate supply. So let's suppose we're showing here an increase in aggregate supply. What's going to happen? Well, we start once again at P1, Y1, but if aggregate supply increases, it's going to shift to the right. As we have this shift in aggregate supply, what do we see? We see easier production capabilities. These lower costs are passed on to consumers who have better bargaining power and buying power with their money. And we have a great situation. We have higher levels of output and we have lower prices. So what have we done here? We've combated both inflation and unemployment because of the increase in aggregate supply. In the real world, we saw this with the implementation of the internet. That's the best possible outcome for a society, and it's a great situation to be in if you are, the elected official or something like that. So an increase in aggregate supply is the best possible example. We're going to work back through this in our example of the handout for the office. Okay. All right, I'm going to scroll back here though and talk about just a couple other things before we wrap up. Talked about this aggregate supply curve again. Increase in aggregate supply, very helpful. Decrease in aggregate supply, very harmful. Maybe we should add that to our notes here for a little perspective. What is very harmful? It's going to be the opposite. Obviously, you're going to have higher inflation and higher unemployment when you have a decrease. In aggregate supply. But very helpful is going to be an increase in aggregate supply. Okay? We showed the effects of an increase. All right. We've gone about 40 minutes here. I'd like to keep this short. Okay. Remember, in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical. We showed that. We talked about the classical model. What can create economic growth in the long run? Only land, labor, capital, technology that increases that aggregate supply curve. Demand pull and cost push inflation. I'll talk about this a little bit with the office handout. Demand pull inflation occurs When the aggregate demand increases, there's more demand for goods and services. That's okay. Cost push inflation is harmful because it occurs when it's difficult to produce goods and services, and those higher costs are then passed along to the consumers, who in many cases are getting laid off because there's less output, being produced in the economy, and therefore higher unemployment. We're going to talk about this with our handout on the office, which I will do next time. Like I said, I don't like to go much over 40 minutes here. Yeah, this page I may save it till Monday. I've talked a little bit about this before, about the Volcker Fed, and I may come back to this. It was very important that the Federal Reserve maintain the stability of our price system, and they were very proactive in combating inflation in the late 1970s. The problem when you have a decrease in aggregate supply is that you have high inflation and high unemployment, and any policy designed to fight inflation tends to make unemployment worse. Any policy designed to fight unemployment tends to make inflation worse. I will explain that in more detail on the office handout next time. Laffer curve, we're too short a time to go into the Laffer curve. I'm going to skip that. And then finally, what did the response to the Great Recession? Tax rebate checks was the primary thing that happened there. And then TARP and other government spending. Just like today, those were expansionary policies, and those did shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. During the Great Recession, we did have relatively high unemployment. It's unfortunately going to get worse, I think, this next month than what we had, the 10% unemployment in the Great Recession. And therefore, then and now, I would argue with some caveats that the government engaging in this expansionary fiscal policy, which again, just to be clear, is designed to shift this aggregate demand curve to the right. Why do we need that? Because aggregate demand had been diminishing due to the conditions happening in the economy, both today and with the Great Recession. So the government's trying to step in to correct that, to push that aggregate demand function back to the right. This is not a perfect model in terms of explaining everything that can happen in the economy, but it's a nice baseline model for us to understand these macroeconomic shifts. So with that, I think I will stop here, and we will pick things up with a review tonight, Wednesday the 15th, review Monday the 20th, Tuesday the 21st. Don't forget, your ECON selfie is due by midnight or by 11:45 p.m. on the 15th, and your exam is going to be at 6:30 p.m. on the 22nd. So with that, thank you for listening, and feel free to put any questions that you have about any of this discussion on the discussion board. I will follow up with a separate video on both the office handout showing changes in aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and also with demonstrating the Keynesian multiplier in a little bit more detail. But this is a good place to stop, and hope everybody's doing well, and I'll be happy to help you with these reviews and hopefully to get ready for our exam on the 22nd. All right, talk to everybody later.